Chapter 6. Pius's Gamble. The history of human institutions is a record of ephemeral lives, often with violent ends. The golden age of Athens, which gave birth to our greatest sculptors as well as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, ended in the bloodbath of Syracuse and the Peloponnesian Wars in less than 100 years. The long reign of Rome and the most long-lasting of Chinese and Egyptian dynasties never reached or barely survived 1,000 years. In the entire history of man, only two institutions approached continuous existence and succession for more than 2,000 years: the Japanese imperial succession and the papacy. To approximately 1.2 billion human beings today, the Pope is both supreme in all matters relating to the Church and infallible when, as Pope, he promulgates teaching on matters involving faith and morals. Why is Rome the headquarters for Catholicism? On first impression, it seems an unlikely choice. Its first and most significant contact with Christianity was the criminal condemnation and crucifixion of Christ by a Roman procurator. Rome has, at best, slight biblical connections. A letter from St. Paul to the small Roman church, an account of Paul's beheading there by Nero, and allusions to Rome as an evil Babylon. Moreover, in Christianity's early years, Rome butchered Christians without mercy. Ephesus, Antioch, or especially Jerusalem would seem to have a far better historical claim to be the capital of Christianity, except for Peter. Fundamental to the legitimacy of the Pope is the belief that Peter was made head of the Church by Christ, who gave him the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And so I say to you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Matthew chapter 16, verses 18 to 19. Catholics believe that Peter in turn passed on this authority to a line of successors, the popes, who succeeded to his authority in what is known as apostolic succession. There have been 266 popes, one after another, each ruling under Peter's mandate. The first 31 popes, with only one exception, were executed by the Romans. Even despite a brief, tumultuous 68 years when the popes ruled from Avignon in France, the papal line has continued unabated with a clear connection to Peter and to Rome. The papacy's tie to Rome, though not foundational to the Catholic faith, has deep emotional, religious, and even political roots, and has been such an enduring part of the Church's tradition that its invalidation would be a deeply unsettling discovery. Even worse, if scientific evidence proved the long-held tradition of Peter's burial beneath the Vatican to be false, it could cause people both within and outside of the Church to call into question much more fundamental Church teachings. Pius XII, 260th in the long-claimed succession of Peter, certainly recognized this danger. If the excavations proved that Peter had never been in Rome, the Church's credibility in other matters, especially after centuries of upheaval, might become subject to serious doubt. If Peter never really came to Rome, if he was never really the leader of a Christian community there and never really passed along his authority to a Roman successor, even the Pope's authority and credibility could more easily be called into question. Various prior and small-scale excavations by Pius's predecessors had totally failed to find Peter. Although they had been conducted in secret, the excavations in the 16th and 17th centuries had eventually become known to the public, giving critics fodder to cast some doubt on papal legitimacy. Faced with growing skepticism in the 20th century world, no doubt exacerbated by the chaos of worldwide war, Pius chose to take one of the great gambles in human history, excavating under the Vatican itself to prove or disprove Peter's arrival and death in Rome. Although he would seek to keep the excavations secret, he must surely have known that the results would leak out, as with the earlier efforts. Pius's decision was a strange and wild bet for a man known to be conservative and risk-averse in most every other way. Why? Almost certainly it was no gamble at all to Pius. He had an almost irrational, unwavering faith that Peter was there and would be found. Christ told Peter, the rock, that he would build his church upon him. Pius firmly believed this statement to be both a symbolic truth and a literal one. He believed that Christendom's greatest church was constructed over Peter's physical remains. The immense search would prove him right or wrong. Chapter 7. Pope Pius XII and his team. Pius and his dreams of Peter. If George Strake was the perfect partner for the Apostle Project, fortune or fate could not have delivered a more committed or enthusiastic leader than Eugenio Pacelli. The search for Peter in many ways began long before 1939 with the childhood dreams of Eugenio Pacelli, who took the name Pius XII when elected Pope in 1939. His family was from Rome and closely connected for over a century with the Vatican. His father had been chief legal advisor to the Vatican, and Pacelli often played there as a child. Pacelli grew up surrounded by Roman antiquities, massive architectural relics from the Roman age like the Colosseum, the Pantheon, and the victory monuments of Roman emperors, such as the arches of Constantine and Septimus Severus, as well as even more ancient obelisks. There were ancient Christian churches throughout Rome and, of course, the Vatican itself, where his family worked. He visited the catacombs that hid the early Christians and would later hide the Jews. Pacelli was thin and sickly, but brilliant. He became fluent in Latin in childhood and wrote an essay about himself in 1889 at the age of 13, in which he stated, "I am inspired by the classics, and the study of Latin gives me the highest enjoyment." He loved reading the great Latin classics, Caesar, Cicero, Virgil, and Augustine of Hippo. According to his uncle, he imagined himself an early Roman martyr like Peter. While long years would pass from his childhood until he launched the Apostle Project, Christian archaeology was his lifelong passion from earliest childhood. When he gazed at the surviving ruins of the empire throughout Rome, from monuments of glory to the humble, dark catacombs where early Christians prayed and were often caught and slaughtered, he imagined the march of the legions and the secret gatherings of Christians. Early career. In 1901, at the age of 25, Eugenio Pacelli was welcomed to the Vatican by a much different predecessor, Leo XIII, beginning 57 continuous years of service in the Vatican that would end only with his death in 1958. Leo recognized from the beginning Pacelli's genius and used him as a pivotal diplomat for the Church. Pacelli dealt throughout his career with the totalitarian scourges of Nazism, fascism, and communism. From his very first year in the Vatican, when he was sent as the Vatican representative for the funeral of Queen Victoria, he was marked as the Church's greatest diplomat. Pacelli quickly became the Vatican's go-to diplomat. In May 1917, at the age of 39, he embarked on perhaps the most important mission of his life. World War I had been the charnel house of the West, leaving many millions dead on the Western Front, in Russia, and in the strange Battle of the Alps between Italy and Austria. At the request of Germany's ally, the Habsburg monarchy in Austria, the Church presented peace proposals to the warring powers. Pacelli met directly with German Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, who reacted favorably to the peace proposals, and it appeared the Great War might end. With the collapse of Russia, however, the Kaiser decided to follow the advice of the German General Staff to launch a massive last-gasp offensive on the Western Front to break the Allies' back. He fired Bethmann-Hollweg and rejected the Vatican peace proposals. From that failure followed the hideous totalitarian evils which Pacelli would spend the rest of his life combating: fascism, Nazism, and communism. Pacelli remained in Germany for the next 10 years, on occasion risking his life combating the Communists and the Nazis. In 1919, he witnessed a brutal massacre by Communists in Munich and narrowly survived threats to his own life. In 1924, while still in Munich, he witnessed the failure of Hitler's beer hall putsch and predicted that Hitler was finished and would never be heard from again. In 1945, when the American diplomat Robert Murphy asked Pope Pius XII how his earlier predictions squared with papal infallibility, Pius replied, "I was only a Monsignor then." Pacelli played a major role in the 1929 Lateran Treaty with Mussolini, establishing the Vatican State. He was virtually a polyglot, fluently speaking at least 7 languages. Despite his numerous speeches against the Nazis, he was deeply involved in the controversial 1933 Reichskonkordat between the Church and Hitler, in which the Church traded non-involvement in the German political process for non-persecution. Critics called it a trade of silence for survival. Its only apparent alternative, confrontation of Hitler, promised instant destruction in Germany to a church that had already seen thousands of priests and believers executed in Mexico, Spain, and elsewhere around the globe. The future pope's participation in the negotiation of the treaty would permanently mar his reputation. The Nazis and the fascists opposed Pacelli's 1939 election to the papacy, and the Nazi security service reported that Pacelli had already made himself prominent by his attacks on National Socialism. Pope Pius XII would soon find himself confronted not by another buffoon like Mussolini, but by Hitler, a man Pius described as an untrustworthy scoundrel and fundamentally wicked person. In 1943, in the depth of World War II and in a Vatican literally surrounded by Nazis and black shirts, Pius XII issued the encyclical Divino Afflante Spiritu, inspired by the Holy Spirit, calling for the study of early biblical texts, archaeological ruins, and Jewish traditions. Calling on the Church to take a leading part in scientific research, he wrote, "It is indeed regrettable that such precious treasures of Christian antiquity are almost unknown." Pius's encyclical also noted the improvements in archaeology. The encyclical did not mention the great secret archaeological project he had already launched underneath the Vatican itself, the search for Peter. In many ways, the Apostle Project required the unlikely confluence of 2 remarkable men whose decisions to participate would have been judged irrational, eccentric, or even insane by their contemporaries. For Pius, always described as cautious and diplomatic, it was clearly a case of faith and dreams overcoming lifelong risk aversion. For George Strake, it was another wildcat, and God was with him. In the most unlikely way, the moment had found the men. So, too, it would, in a few years, find an equally unlikely but indispensable woman. The Apostle Project Team. In late 1939, Pius XII organized the team he intended to use on the Apostle Project. He determined to keep the project a complete secret from the world except for the disclosure to George Strake. To ensure this secrecy, he made the fateful decision to use only priests and Vatican workers for the project. He also determined that only picks and shovels, no power tools, would be used for the work, both to avoid detection and to minimize destruction, a decision that greatly lengthened the project. In effect, the excavation would be done using the same methods the Romans had used to fill the necropolis some 1,600 years earlier. The decision to use only an inside team without outside experts would prove to be a serious mistake. It is likely that Pius wished to prevent disillusionment of the faithful if the project once again turned up only pagan graves. Although word would almost certainly leak out eventually, he wished to control when and how the disclosure would occur. He was also probably equally concerned with any false claims of success. Finally, the fascists who held power throughout Italy were obsessed with their Roman heritage, even destroying the great Capitoline Hill to build the pseudo-Roman Victor Emmanuel Monument, the monstrous wedding cake that now stands in the center of the city. It is likely they would have interfered with and even seized control of the project had they known of it. Their very name was derived from the fasces, the bundle of rods carried by lictors in early Rome. They would clearly have gloried in the ancient Roman tombs beneath the Vatican, since they imagined themselves as the spiritual and physical descendants of the Romans. Pius XII turned to his closest inside advisors as his team on this project. He first selected Ludwig Kaas to run the excavation under the Vatican. Kaas, a German priest, had been Pius XII's closest advisor and friend during his long diplomatic efforts in pre-Nazi Germany. A longtime member of the German Reichstag and leader of the Christian Center Party, Kaas was also deeply involved in opposition to Hitler and in support of the controversial 1933 agreement with Hitler after he had become Chancellor. That support had earned him threats from both the Nazis and from those in Germany opposed to the 1933 agreement. For his safety, Kaas was moved to St. Peter's in 1935 to prevent his arrest and execution by the Nazis. It is an indication of the extreme importance of the Apostle Project that Pius selected Kaas, perhaps his closest friend in the world, as supervisor, reporting directly to the Pope on its progress. Kaas, however, had absolutely no experience in or knowledge of archaeology or excavation. A priest named Antonio Ferrua, who held a 1937 doctorate in archaeology, maneuvered his way onto the excavation team and soon assumed practical control of it. Ferrua's actual field experience in real-world excavations was limited, as he had received his doctorate only 2 years before. He was a perfect bureaucratic functionary, assuming control and power through force of personality, control of access to information, and clever maneuvers. He was attentive to colleagues, wrote prolifically in journals, and assiduously courted professional associates. He had a perhaps unjustifiably high view of his own ability and bitterly resented disagreement or criticism. Involvement with the Apostle Project, as well as access to those in control, offered Ferrua a road to fame, position, and power, and allowed him to demonstrate his talents. Within a short time, Ferrua had self-promoted himself into practical control of the excavation, wholly excluding Kaas from day-to-day information and treating him with contempt, only allowing him to learn of the excavation's progress through inspection or questioning individual workmen. Ferrua simply refused to talk to him, causing serious problems for the project. Ferrua was assisted by others, including a good-natured German priest from Cologne, Father Engelbert Kirschbaum, a member of the Papal Archaeological Academy, of which he was the director from 1949 to 1958, and a professor of Christian archaeology who was harmonious and kind. Because the team was limited to working with picks and shovels, an army of inside laborers was employed. Other Vatican officials assisted. The lighting was dim and the site was hot, poorly ventilated, and dusty. The vast bulk of the Vatican above created a serious risk of the excavation site caving in. In the world of archaeology, known for dangerous and arduous work sites, this was among the worst, hazardous, cramped, and roasting in summer. In addition to the inside team, Pius XII delegated his secretary, Giovanni Montini, to form an outside team to deal with strake and other critical matters. Montini was assisted by American priests Walter Carroll and later Joseph McGuff. Unbeknownst to any of the participants as the project commenced, a young woman named Margherita Guarducci labored in Crete over long-forgotten Greek inscriptions. In a male-dominated age, church, and profession, none of the participants would have believed it possible that this unlikely woman, or any woman, would play a serious role in the Apostle Project. Eventually, and ironically, she, and she alone, by force of her own genius and tenacity, would solve the great puzzle. She would make discoveries under the Vatican beyond the wildest dreams of the initial team of excavators. Chapter 8. The Clues in the Vatican Library. The Vatican Library houses the greatest collection of early writings in the world. With the destruction of the great Library of Alexandria and the barbarian invasions of the Roman Empire, most classical and early Christian writings were lost forever. The total cultural history of Greece, Rome, and the West nearly perished in the ashes of the empire. Numerous plays by Sophocles, writings by the great Greek philosophers, detailed Roman histories, and early Christian writings were completely destroyed. The entire heritage of the West might itself have become like Egyptian and Mayan history, only a faint, dead reconstruction from faded inscriptions. But here and there, ancient writings survived. At Constantinople, where the knowledge of the old empire was maintained until its conquest in 1453, in monasteries scattered from Ireland to Admont and Melk in Austria, at St. Peter's, and in other remote places. Over the 1600 years between construction of the old St. Peter's and 1940, the originals and copies of virtually every surviving early Christian or Roman work found their way to the Vatican Library. It housed well over 1 million books, manuscripts, and papyrus, as well as 75,000 ancient codices, many found nowhere else in the world. The Apostle Project team's first job before beginning the actual excavation under the Vatican was to search the ancient documents in the Vatican Library for clues and guidance to the whereabouts of Peter. Their research began in 1939 to 1940. Was there ancient confirmation that he really came to Rome? Was there proof that he was buried there, and if so, where and how? What markers or memorials were mentioned in ancient contemporary literature? What happened to the tomb, if it existed, in the intervening centuries of barbarian, Saracen, and German looting of the Vatican? The Vatican Library is the ultimate repository of the Church's secrets. This is probably why the position of head librarian has always been occupied by well-regarded and very serious priests of great intelligence, such as Pius XI. The library contains works as tragic as the 1311 plea for help from 231 Knights Templar about to be burned at the stake, and the final letter of Mary, Queen of Scots, awaiting execution by her relative, Queen Elizabeth I. It also contains works as trivial as Michelangelo's letters complaining over his pay for the Sistine Chapel. There is, additionally, an ancient secret history of the reign of Emperor Justinian, written about 600, and a plea from many English nobles and churchmen to the Pope on behalf of Henry VIII's attempted divorce from Catherine of Aragon. The library also contains numerous documents of great historical significance, including the excommunication of Martin Luther and the trial of Joan of Arc. It even contains Galileo's signed renunciation of his belief that the earth revolved around the sun, which he made to avoid execution as a heretic. The Vatican Library is truly the smorgasbord of Western historical documents, secret and public, tragic and triumphant, gathered for well over 500 years, often with no other copy in the world. The sheer size of the Vatican Library is both its strength and its weakness. Even today, it is often said that some librarians can find documents that others cannot locate. In 1939 to 1940, there were only crude manual indexes to the ancient documents. It likely took more than a year to mine the Vatican Library for clues to Peter's death and burial, and to make other preparations. The task began, of course, with the Bible itself, which paints a full, if conflicting, picture of Peter during Christ's life. He was both incredibly brave and cowardly, but always deeply devoted to Christ. The Bible provided important clues to the physical characteristics of Peter. He was a Jew from Palestine, a fisherman, and likely quite robust. Assuming he was roughly the same age as Christ in AD 30, He would have been in his 60s by 64 to 66, the time of Nero's persecution. If the later accounts that claimed he was crucified upside down were true, his relics would show forensic evidence not only of age, but also the great violence to which he was subjected. The Bible, with the exception of 2 letters written by Peter, leaves Peter in Jerusalem in 44, almost 20 years before his death. The 2 much later undated letters from Peter, believed to have been written in about 66, are clearly penned by a man on the run from persecution to followers also facing persecution and death. However, they infer Peter's presence in Babylon, a code word used by ancient Christians and Jews for evil, materialistic Rome. The Bible likewise contains the final letter of Peter's comrade, St. Paul, clearly written from Rome while he was awaiting his execution by Nero. The time of my departure is at hand. I have competed well. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 6 to 7. Paul's burial site, on the road to Rome's Port Ostia, just outside Rome's walls, has been continuously maintained by Christians since his death in 64 to 65. Ignatius of Antioch, an early Christian who knew Peter, wrote while being brought to Rome for execution in 105 that he would be joining Peter and Paul, who were buried there. The Apostle Project excavators also located a letter written by a presbyter named Gaius around 200, responding to the boasting of a heretical leader named Proclus. I can show you the trophies of the apostles, for whether you go to the Vatican Hill or to the Ostian Road, you will meet with the monuments of them who by their preaching and miracles founded this church. By trophies, Gaius referred to the tombs of the apostles. In the case of Paul, Gaius's words are validated. Christians continue to honor Paul's actual grave on the Port Road. Finding the so-called trophy of Gaius marking Peter's gravesite thus became central to the search. The excavators believed that if the monument erected by early Christians and described by Gaius survived, Peter would be near or under it. To further complicate matters, however, the excavators found early writings that warned that the site of Peter's burial had been used as bait by the Romans to lure and capture Christians. Constantine's Treasure. One of the most extraordinary books of history is the Liber Pontificalis, Book of the Popes. It is like a yearbook for the Catholic Church, maintained for 1,500 years. Written intermittently since before the fall of the Western Roman Empire, it contains biographies and summaries of the popes from Peter until Pope Pius II in 1464, written by a series of different authors from the 5th century forward. This book provided definitive guidance to the Apostle Project. According to the Liber Pontificalis, Constantine surrounded the grave of Peter with a marble enclosure and then centered the original St. Peter's Basilica directly over Peter's remains, which were placed in a large bronze sarcophagus. Within the marble enclosure, Constantine assembled a great treasure of gold and silver objects to honor Peter. These included hundreds of pounds of golden crowns, thousands of pounds of silver objects, and other ancient artifacts. The treasure was reportedly topped by a massive 150-pound golden cross inscribed with the name of Constantine and his mother Helena. The Liber Pontificalis reportedly relied upon a letter written by Constantine himself, and it was definitive on the subject of Peter's tomb, providing exact measurements and precise dimensions. If the Liber Pontificalis was correct, the excavators should be able simply to go to the center of the basilica, locate and break through Constantine's marble enclosure, and find not only Peter, but also one of history's greatest treasure troves. Discouragingly, various authorities indicate that during the late persecutions, 250 to 311, remains of the Christian dead lost their protected status under Roman law and were routinely desecrated and destroyed. Like the Nazis' desecration of Jewish cemeteries throughout Europe, the ancient Roman persecutors even made war on the dead. Perhaps Peter's remains had been destroyed long before the time of Constantine. Perhaps the search would turn up nothing at all.